This wasn't what I expected my next video to be about. I had plans to do a video about a bigger, much more well-known series of games, but a few weeks ago, I was having a bad day, and I wanted to play something to take my mind off things. I wanted a puzzle game, something that would make my brain have to focus on something else for a while, and I just so happened to stumble on a little game called The Witness. I'm not embarrassed to say that the next time I looked away from my computer, over 5 hours had passed, and this was the only thing I was thinking about. But here's the thing. The Witness is a game where you draw straight lines onto grids and walk around a world with no characters in it, trying to find more grids to draw straight lines onto. Legitimately, that's it. There isn't even any background music unless you count the odd audio recording about Jesus, so why was this thing so engaging to me? How did I finish the whole 20-hour campaign in 3 days, and what does this game do better than the dozens of other puzzle games that I've played that I've quit an hour or two in? Games, bear in mind, with much more interesting mechanics than just drawing straight lines onto grids. That's what this video's about. How does The Witness work? Also, I realise this game isn't something that everybody has in their library or wishlist, and I think this game's pretty special, and I don't want to spoil that for anyone. I'll be using examples in this video, but unless absolutely necessary, it'll be kept to the first 2 hours of gameplay. If you want to go into this game totally blind, then read the disclaimer at the bottom of the description and stop watching now. For everybody else though, I actually want to talk about the lead developer first, a man called Jonathan Blow. He made a puzzle game about time travel and platforming called Braid back in 2009, then put all of the money he made from it and 7 years of development time into The Witness. He has a very strong design philosophy of working at something until it's good, which he says anything will be given enough time. He mentioned in an interview how his next game might be out in 20 years or so, to give you an idea on that. That effort definitely shines through in the world design of The Witness. Even just walking around and recording footage was fun. There's variety in the different regions and the colours are bright and saturated. A lot of care clearly went into it, and John even hired actual architects to make sure his buildings and ruins were structurally correct. It makes a place you actually want to explore, which you will be doing. There's a lot of downtime in between puzzles where you're just walking around the island. You're gonna be looking at it a lot. The concept of the puzzles are good as well, even if they do feel like something you'd find on the back of a cereal box. The depth is definitely there though, and more polish clearly went into the puzzles than anything else in the game, which is a massive compliment. Every puzzle boils down to starting from the circle and making your way to the exit, fulfilling some condition that's either been explained explicitly on the tiles, or implicitly by the rest of the world. There are more than 500 puzzles in the game, and they do a good job of feeling important in one way or another. But we'll get to that. There's a lot I want to say about this game's puzzles, but also a lot I want to keep secret. You know that saying about how you can't deconstruct a joke without killing it entirely? It's a bit like that. So, given that, this game's puzzles are constantly working to keep themselves fresh. Throughout the game, you're making assumptions about how to solve the puzzle. The dots appear to be able to split like this, so I should be able to solve it by going like this, that kind of thing. But then something throws your answer totally off course. Maybe the path you want to take is broken, or the answer that seemed obvious actually crosses over itself. So then by that point you rethink it and try something new, but then even that doesn't take something different into account. The designer has been very careful to do just enough to deliberately mislead the player, because once they've almost got it, then they're invested. It leads to situations where you're totally hooked, and your mind and desk are both a total mess because of all the frantic thoughts and lines you scribble down onto random bits of paper. It's amazing. Imagine this wasn't the case, but the game still wanted to keep its difficulty as hard as it is, because believe me, this game very much gets tricky at times. The only other way to do it, really, would be for every puzzle to be on enormous grids, with new mechanics introduced every 20 minutes. That might sound like a fine idea, because you're eliminating the possibility of guesswork, and you're keeping the gameplay fresh, right? Actually, what ends up happening is you create a situation so difficult to understand that the player would either be totally overwhelmed by choice and not even attempt the puzzle in the first place, or if they do solve it, there's not really a way of making a clever solution with all that information. They'll just be glad that it's over. Instead, by keeping the toolset of mechanics relatively small, you allow players to develop a real understanding of how everything works and fits together. And that's a very normal principle of game design. By making everything as simple as possible, you're allowed to properly explore an idea, and the player's allowed to properly learn about the idea. Then, when it comes time to remix that idea into something new, they're going to understand what's going on, and remember how the rules of that mechanic work. It's something you see in all different genres of game. A lot of the time, when you're faced with a problem in The Witness, the trouble isn't really finding out the answer, it's finding out what the question is. The designers need to be careful to keep it as simple as possible. It's the only way that interesting twists of a puzzle can even happen in this kind of game. Sure, you want to mislead the player about what the solution to your puzzle is, but you definitely don't want to misinform them about the question. It's good to watch happen. Regular principles of game design are used in a way I don't think is very common with most puzzle games. I think something that's good about this method is you let the player eventually feel like they know what's going on. You allow them to develop a proper understanding. When you find a new area in the Witness, you'll usually be greeted by a puzzle that looks nothing like what you've done so far. In other games, this would be a time where a text box would show up, or the companion character, to explain how this mechanic works. The designers of those games aren't wrong to do this, even if their mechanics weren't as complicated as some of the ones found in The Witness. And yet, The Witness has no dialogue, or text boxes or signposts telling you how to solve it. Instead, it teaches you how the concept works at its most basic level, on a grid where you'll probably accidentally solve the puzzle. Then, when you use that idea for something harder, you need to go back, look at your solution and ask what it was that worked. You end up teaching yourself the rules of the mechanic. You'll be in a totally separate part of the map, solving a problem with a lot more complex parts, but because you learned it all in a way that makes sense to you, there's never really too much information. If you know when to walk away from something you don't understand yet, then I practically guarantee that you'll be able to come back and solve everything in this game at some point. It's just all down to your understanding. In fact, that's something else I adore about this game's design. Very early on, you'll see a problem that you don't understand, with a grid that makes guesswork very difficult. You'll have a few tries, but it's not going to make sense, and the grid is just too big that you don't want to guess, so you walk away. In fact, there's a good chance this could be the single first puzzle that you find after leaving the first tutorial garden, and I think that's genius. From the very start of the game, you're telling players that it's okay not to understand the solution, or even any of the moving parts. You tell them it's fine, keeps in the back of your mind, which you will, by the way, this thing feels very secret and important, and come back to it if it ever feels right. But don't just guess now, you'll be here forever. And so the player does. They walk away, they think about the black and white squares and the dots in between, and yeah, at some point they'll come back and they'll solve this puzzle, and they'll feel a better sense of growth than most other kinds of game could dream of. It's not your stats that are increasing, it's your understanding, and it's incredible. But even still, the game isn't just doing that. It isn't just giving the player a satisfying feeling for properly understanding the mechanic. You've taught them something. Not about how the actual game works though. Instead, you've taught them that they can walk away from something they don't understand, and they can still return and feel satisfied. Through this, you're subconsciously teaching the player that if you can't figure out what a puzzle's asking from you, you shouldn't just guess it. The majority of this game's puzzles are 4x4 grids with 70 possible solutions. That's not impossible to guess by any means, but after so much reinforcement from this one and the game's other standout puzzles, you don't even try to guess, at least after the first or second go. And that's amazing! This is a game where there's nothing stopping you from solving any puzzle at any time except for your own understanding. There's no physical locks blocking your way of solving this game's hardest problems until you clear something on the other side of the map. There's nothing like that. For a game like this, the player cannot be allowed to guess their way to a solution. But the game being designed like this means that even when you easily could have guessed how a puzzle could be solved, you're only going to realise that in hindsight. There is an example of me spending 45 minutes on one of this game's optional puzzles, and when I finally found out the answer, it was something I could have come up with in 2. It does an incredible job of nudging the player away from trial and error, meaning that when they do solve the puzzle, it's every part as satisfying as the developers intended. You always feel like a genius, instead of feeling like you looked into the right solution. It's smart design, but it's also economical design for the type of game this is. But isolated, I'd still only say that you have a pretty good puzzle game on your hands, instead of what we have here. Really, and this is the main thing that I want to say, this game's bizarre choice of genre is the reason why it all works, and in fact, the only genre this game could ever be. The island of the Witness is clever in a few ways. Firstly, the size and the scope of it. The island is big. You've got 11 main zones to worry about, which all flow and connect into one another. It feels daunting at first, but after you've given a few areas in the game a proper try and chosen to backtrack to other parts of the map once or twice, something clicks. The whole island is the perfect size that it's just barely able to be thought about all at once, just like the rest of the game. Couple that with how most of the time you're able to walk past and through different regions of the map without solving them, and you remove my biggest problem with open worlds. Even though there isn't any combat or even any music, because I'm constantly moving through different set pieces and locations, and because I usually have a tangible goal in mind, it's pretty hard for me to feel bored. That isn't really why I think The Witness's open world is special though. There are lots of games with small open worlds, and some that do it a lot better and have it a lot more compact than The Witness does. The real smart design comes when you combine it with everything that I've already said about this game's puzzle design. For example, this puzzle, which is presented in a similar way to the one I showed earlier. It's basically impossible to solve without prior knowledge. If this puzzle was placed randomly in some corner of the world, you'd probably forget about it once you'd solved the surrounding area. That isn't what this game does though. In actuality, that puzzle is placed somewhere visually memorable and harder to get to, on this rusted old boat. Already, before you can even see this puzzle, you're interested. Then, when you try it out and inevitably can't figure out the answer, or again, when you can't really figure out the question, you leave thinking about it. And not just the puzzle, you leave thinking about what happened to the ship, or if you can go into any of the other rooms in the ship, or if there's anywhere else like that in the game. Combine this with the fact that, and I'm trying really hard not to spoil here, the player can leave the ship after not solving the puzzle and still make some tangible progress toward an endgame goal, you really do have something special. That last little detail of the player not walking away empty-handed makes it not feel like a waste of time, and for a lot of people, that makes all the difference. Just in this one tiny area, where there is literally one single puzzle, by the way, you have so much care and polish. There are more moments like this, and it's something that's great about having an open world. Because we're not dealing with a linear story or progression, we don't have to solve everything the first time around. By creating little pockets like this throughout the world, you end up building something that the player comes back to and thinks about during the course of an adventure. But also, none of this is artificial. The player only comes back if they cared enough to remember or if they think they're skilled enough to give it another go. This isn't required to beat the game, and they probably know that. It's interesting, and the game's not afraid that some people might not ever properly understand or care enough to come back. It's like John said in an interview. It's not really a puzzle unless you might not figure it out, right? If you're guaranteed to figure it out, it's probably not that interesting. If you wanted to design your own puzzle game, you could do much worse than having The Witness as inspiration. Sure, the puzzles are smart, and the world's pretty to look at, but the magic of this game comes from everything working all at once. This game is so much more than the sum of its parts, which probably shouldn't be too surprising, given the whole drawing straight lines onto grids thing. It goes out of its way to create something that's interesting, and doesn't care about turning certain players away or if they miss content. Maybe to a fault, actually. Some proper accessibility options would have been nice, considering I left a few play sessions feeling pretty motion sick, and it is hard to recommend this game to somebody who has problems distinguishing colours or sounds properly. But weirdly, I'm more okay with that than I should be. While I think the accessibility options should have been a priority, this game was clearly designed not to be for everybody. John said that in interviews. But when you commit something as hard as The Witness commits to its open world and hands-off structure, you already know that you're going to turn some players off straight away, before any gameplay's even started. You really do get left with something unique though, and for the players that it resonates with, they're going to have a hard time forgetting about this game. It'll connect with the target market so much more than if the designers just played it safe and wanted everybody to like it. After all, if everybody were guaranteed to like it, it's probably not that interesting. Thanks for watching.